It's good to see some of you staying on and others joining us. I'm going to introduce our moderator, so at least you will know who he is. I think almost everybody in this room knows who Doug Saunders is. He is one of my favorite journalists in the world and is the foreign affairs guy at the Globe and Mail. Used to be bureau chief for Europe, based in London, and has been back here a couple of years. And sitting to his left is Andriy Kamenshikov, who is a real honest-to-God, on-the-ground peace worker who goes around trying to make people be peaceable. He invents things in communities that help build trust and confidence and reduce real community stresses. I think the thing that most interested me was he was telling me once about a place he goes into. He's in the Caucasus a lot, although he lives in Moscow. And he was telling me about a town in some place in the Dagestan or someplace, Chechnya, where there's a lot of stress between teenage boys and the cops. And so he buys soccer equipment, uniforms and balls and stuff, and he gets the police to go out and organize a soccer team and coach them, of these young hoodlums. And I don't know, did it work?
Yeah, at one point it worked. Pretty well,
yeah, he does a lot of that kind of thing. So and he is a coordinator for a whole network of peace organizations in Russia and I guess a wider region, right? So anyway, he will be a speaker. And we have an invisible man. Even they rolled the screen up because the person who's going to speak first is Andriy Kulykov, who is a journalist, a radio and television journalist in Ukraine, and who is probably out on the road someplace in some little town. I don't know where you are, Andriy, but I hope you're all right. And he isn't within reach of Skype, apparently. But they've set up some deal where they're going to have a telephone conversation with him, and he will give a presentation. And then there's John Feffer, who is not here. But he sent me an email a while ago saying that his plane should land, I think, at the island airport at 4:30. So he could be arriving any time now and joining us. If not, it just means that the Kulykov and Andriy Kamenshikov are going to have a little more time to give their talks, and I'm sure that Doug Saunders can amplify as needed because he knows his stuff. Okay, Doug Saunders.
Thank you, Meta, and thank you everyone for coming to this very polyglot and ecumenical event. Briefly, I'm going to just speak for a few minutes about the lay of the land, but just briefly about how this panel is going to work and how we'll be talking afterwards. We're focusing here on the question of solutions. We've had two previous panels on the backdrop and on the questions of what happened. This is going to be focused very exclusively on what specific things, political, diplomatic, economic, or military, can be done to bring an end to the all-out war in eastern Ukraine. And an interesting moment, doubly so. It's a year since the Ukrainian parliament voted out Viktor Yanukovych, and Ukraine began on its new direction. And it's a few days since the second ceasefire was negotiated, and at this point we can say pretty decisively has failed, as the first one did. In the space in between that, in the 12 months in between, we've seen the question of how to end this change dramatically in the way it's discussed in governments in the West and the East, in media, in Ukraine. We've sort of had three moments that have really changed the dialogue around solutions. I think the first was approximately the point where Russia formally declared Crimea to be part of its territory, which suddenly took the idea of institutional and government solutions to this crisis to a new level, and suddenly the ideas that were in the air were targeted sanctions against Russian institutions and individuals, negotiated settlement, and providing assistance but not arms to the Ukrainian military. Those things were in the air and worked to varying degrees. And there was the general hope above all this that some mild pressure and against Russia, some mild concessions on the Ukrainian end would cause the troops to back off, would cause the simmering conflict at that point in the East to simmer down and all that to end. I think the second watershed occurred with the downing of flight MH17, which I think made governments everywhere realize that this had become a serious war with real human consequences, and that the more mild diplomatic solutions were not going to work. I think that caused people to back away from that. That brought into the air the idea of more heavily arming the Ukrainian military, with some worries, in the sense that it also created a sense that both of the militaries were being very inaccurate and very dangerous in this. And we started seeing overflights and things like this. There started to be a debate about the use of NATO, at least symbolically, in this. And I'd say the third watershed has occurred around the two failed ceasefires, particularly at the moment. Because the second ceasefire, the one that essentially is failing at the moment, was built around this idea of a negotiated settlement that would have involved a more federal structure for Ukraine. It was essentially built around the idea that Vladimir Putin had been seeking to have the eastern districts of Ukraine become something like Abkhazia and South Ossetia are in Georgia. And the fact that even that very large concession would not result in a ceasefire from either side, I think did a lot of damage to that idea of that sort of a negotiated settlement, to the idea of offering federalism as a solution. And I think it's also killed the idea of arming the Ukrainian military, in the eyes of most of the governments I've been speaking to lately. I think there's an understanding at this point that the Ukrainian military does not have the competence or training or anything to achieve anything, even if it was heavily armed up by the West. And that at best, in maybe 2 years, it could achieve that kind of tactical competence, by which point it would be much too late. And I think we're having a new conversations happen in the major capitals of Europe. And the two big things I hear from Germans from both major governing parties and from the Green Party, from British officials, from some Americans that are new on the agenda, are moving beyond economic sanctions targeted at specific organizations and individuals in Russia to a discussion of a much more extreme total economic isolation of Russia. It helps that gas supplies are now available from other places that are coming on stream and so on in Europe. Or a NATO strike, which is suddenly something that actually is at least something that places like Germany and Britain are willing to discuss as a serious possibility. The Kosovo solution is what some people call it. I don't know whether that will ever come to anything, but it suddenly is something that is not being dismissed by these people. So we've gone from a point of mild diplomatic solutions to a point where actual military strikes are being contemplated, and all those other things are still on the table. So I'll leave it to the panelists here to talk about what they're seeing on the ground and what they think could work at this point, now that we've had this series of watershed moments of failures of other efforts, and in the context of other things. So let's start, given that it's 7 hours in the future in Kyiv at the moment, or in Ukraine in general, with Andriy Kulykov, who is speaking by Skype. Can you hear me, Andriy?
Yes, I do. I can.
So Andriy, just briefly, he worked for the BBC in London for many years, since really the beginning of Ukrainian independence, since that era. He hosts a live political talk show on Ukraine on ICTV, and he was a co-founder of Public Radio Ukraine, and has been all over this country during this conflict. Where are you now, Andriy?
I have just come from Kharkiv to Kyiv. Kharkiv, where today a terrorist attack took place during what was supposed to be a peaceful march to commemorate the memory of people who were killed in Kyiv on Maidan during the protests against Mr. Yanukovych's government. The security service says that there was a radio-controlled explosive device that exploded just as the march started. 2 people killed, 9 wounded, a lot of confusion, a lot of thoughts about what's going to happen next. And the Ukrainian security service says that traces lead to Russia. We'll still have to check this. We'll still have to see how well-grounded or well-founded those claims are. And the people in Kharkiv, the activists, the pro-Ukrainian activists, say that tomorrow they will hold a rally to commemorate the victims of today's tragedy. And of course, if people were to hold rallies to commemorate every victim of this conflict, of this war, then these rallies would go on for I don't know how long, because every day we lose people. We lose people on both sides of the front line. From where I am now and from my country and from going to different places, and I've been to at least 6 regional centers in last month, and to a very important strategically frontline city of Mariupol in eastern Ukraine, I think that the simplest answer to the question what has to be done to stop the war, the simplest answer is to make Russia somehow stop interfering into Ukrainian affairs. But then another question arises: how do you make this? How you achieve this? And this is one of the questions to which I honestly don't have an answer. Of course, there are many, many options that people here discuss. For instance, I've heard from some people from Russia, and yesterday, by the way, in Kyiv, there was a round table between academics and public figures from Ukraine and Russia. And some of them say that nothing is going to change until Mr. Putin leaves his office. And they say further that he will leave his office only when he's actually alive no more. On the other hand, very few people believe that there's a military solution to the issue which would play into Ukraine's hands. I've heard the opening remarks, and although I do not see the Ukrainian military as incompetent and as unskilled as one might hear in the opening remarks, there's a lot of truth in that, because yes, of course, even if the non-lethal weapons are provided to Ukrainian army, it takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of time to make Ukrainian military learn how to use them, and to do this you have to have NATO or US instructors on the ground, which in turn gives Russia a pretext to say, listen, now they have NATO servicemen in the Ukrainian territory, and this is going to be a pretext for further intervention, for further intrusion, whatever you call it. So, another option, of course, is to freeze the conflict, but some people would actually opt for this, and many people in Ukraine who are tired and worn out by the war say, okay, let's freeze the conflict for some time, let's try to build a normal life on the rest of the Ukrainian territory, on occupied Ukrainian territory, and occupied territory, of course, includes not only the eastern part of Donbass, but Crimea as well. And those people say, when we build a normal life, then those territories would want to come back to us. Well, maybe people on those territories would want, but then again, there's Russia, there's a proclamation that Crimea is supposed to be an integral part of the Russian territory, and again, this is not a solution. What remains for us? Well, to be vigilant, to be patient, to see what happens. I don't think that any measure of NATO military participation in the conflict may be a solution, as I've said. The idea of blue helmets or UN peacekeepers, well, maybe some people say that if there's a contingent of military personnel, of peacekeepers from third parties, from third countries, not NATO, not Russia and Russian allies, but some other forces, then maybe this would be like a solution between the war and sides. Well, at the moment, this is what some people are talking about. Otherwise, again, I hark back to what I've said at the very beginning. Russia has to stop interference. How to achieve this, I don't know. Economic sanctions will hardly work. And the mood of the people in Russia is still, well, maybe we cannot call it pro-war, but then it is aimed at, I would say, they think that they can interfere in their neighbors' affairs under the pretext of protecting Russian-speaking population or whatever. Hello.
Yes, Andriy, that's. Let me ask you just quickly before we move on to the next panelist. Do you feel that there are any initiatives that should have been conducted more aggressively toward that? I mean, do you think that that the negotiated ceasefire agreements could have been pursued better? Do you think that the arming of the military could have been done more? Do you think that Russia could have been hit harder with sanctions?
Well, it could have been hit harder, but again, they would recoil. They would recoil. Any measure of sanctions against Russia, they can interpret, for instance, the sanctions. They hit not only the people whom they are aimed against, like top brass or top Russian officials or some companies, they are also hitting rank and file Russians. If not directly, the West hits them, then the Russian sanctions in return, you probably know that, for instance, there is no the import of EU goods and foods into Russia has decreased dramatically, and this is being blamed on sanctions. So there's every round of sanctions, at least this is how I feel, only leads to the inflagration of the so-called patriotic feelings among many, many Russians. So hitting, well, maybe it is just, but it doesn't work from my point of view, from what we see and hear here in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I should say there's this paradox of the Russian sanctions in that the decline in petroleum prices has hurt the Russian economy and people so hard that a lot of governments have started saying, well, do we actually need to have these sanctions because they're being hurt badly enough by this anyway. I mean, when I speak to anti-Putin dissidents and politicians in Russia now, what they say is they have a sense of confidence that we're going to have a return of the 2011 middle class uprisings and if the economy continues the way it is, there'll be a movement to push Putin out within a couple of years anyway. And at the same time, there's a desire to talk about a much more total sanctions regime and so on. So I think there's a real dissonance and chaos around that concept of economic response to Russia now. Anyway, that's something to put in the minds of our next speakers. I'm pleased to see that John Feffer's here. Why don't we let you gather your thoughts and go third, okay?
That'd be great. I appreciate
it. So we have Andriy Kamenshikov here. Andriy is the regional representative of Nonviolence International for the CIS states, the post-Soviet states, and has been active in peace building really since the beginning, the end of the USSR, since that era, right? And it says you've worked in the various conflict areas, Abkhazia, Transnistria, South Ossetia as well? Chechnya? Yes. So in all the places where this status as Russian or non-Russian territory around the periphery has been under dispute. And his current work involves developing local capacities for peace in areas of potential and acute violent conflict, primarily in North Caucasus, where he works closely with local NGOs and civil activists. So Andriy has been engaged with the concrete questions of how to end conflicts like this on the ground. So I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I just should say, and this is connected to the developments in Ukraine, that while what's been written here for me is true, I had to discontinue my work in the North Caucasus areas. So this year made a decision to end that because it became basically impossible to continue, especially taking into account that lately I was very much involved with networking with other civil society organizations on the Ukrainian situation, and it just became impossible to continue the work our group was doing in North Caucasus. So yes, we have this experience, but we're not actively continuing this work anymore as for the last few months. And as I mentioned, most of my work, let's say not my organization maybe, but my work over the last year was actually focused on the situation in Ukraine. I happen to be a coordinator of a network of civil society organizations in that part of the world, and most of our organizations are actually Ukrainian organizations. It's one of the branches of what is called the Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict, which is actually a global network of civil society groups working for peace. But it's because it's global, it's subdivided in 15 regions, and one region, which basically the Eastern European region, is the local network that I coordinate. Most organizations are actually Ukrainian organizations, so obviously they've been very, very much involved with all the events that were taking place recently, and myself, I've been to Ukraine numerous times, probably at least a dozen times over the last year. So based on that, and as well as based on my previous experience, I would like to speak about some potentials for the future. Some, let's say, something that I would like to hope for as possible positive scenarios. But I also would like to first mention some important, some common misconceptions that I think people have about the conflict, and that maybe interfere in locating reasonable solutions. So, to be brief, first of all, I would like to say that the conflict that we see today in eastern Ukraine should not be put in one row with other interethnic conflicts that took place over the past two decades after the collapse of the USSR. And it should not be interpreted as an interethnic Russia versus Ukrainian conflict. The reality is that there are ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians fighting on both sides. They are citizens of Russia fighting, for example, on the Ukrainian side today, as well as other people from other countries. So when people say that it's more a civil war, I would probably agree with that. But in a sense, it's a civil war not just for Russia, for Ukraine, but for Russia as well. And it's not just because they're Russian citizens on both sides, but also because it's basically connected to two different views of the future of both Ukraine and Russia itself that people have, and people that have been involved and influenced by this. The fact that it's not an inter-ethnic conflict in the traditional sense of view is actually an important asset, because ethnic identities are so strongly entrenched, at least in some parts of the world, that when you have a clear division along ethnic lines, it's much, much more difficult to overcome these divisions. And in a sense, I would say this is an asset. It gives a little more hope than it would be in a different situation. Another very important point that I think it's important to make is that while there's lots of talk about Putin, what Putin thinks, what Putin's actions are, and there are opinion polls that can be very questionable, but that more or less show that Putin does have significant popular support within the Russian Federation. Well, one thing is, of course, there are lots of dissident voices, as well as mine, but the other fact is that this support does not mean that there is a massive support for a war with Ukraine and Russia. In fact, I am under the impression that despite whatever propaganda is doing, it's nearly impossible to sell to the Russian population in general a concept of a all-out war with Ukraine as such. And I think that the reason that this war is being disguised and Russian involvement is being disguised in many ways is precisely the result of that. It's not really Western powers that the Russian government is trying to fool by doing the way that things are done. It's basically trying to hide from its own population this reality, and that's also, in a sense, an asset, because I do not believe today that there is a potential for a major military escalation, because, well, number one, I don't think that Russia really has the military power for a war with such a country as Ukraine, and two, because this kind of war simply it's something that you can't sell to your own people. So that's something that I think is important to keep in mind. Another mistake that people make often, and for example, on a previous panel that I enjoyed listening to all the speakers very much, and I don't know who of the speakers I have more disagreements with that I would like to discuss, but I really enjoyed it. One of the things that may confuse people is they say, well, this conception that the decision-making in Russia is very clear and centralized and so forth. Well, there's no question that there's one man that really makes key decisions in Russia. But that does not exclude the fact that there are very, very different groups in his surroundings that are trying to promote competing policies. And my feeling and my what I know from some things that I witnessed myself being in Ukraine, and from my watching the media and various reports about especially the beginning of the war in the east of Ukraine, is that yes, this was not really a direct operation, but certainly it wasn't of the government, but it certainly wasn't something that could be explained as just some kind of genuine rebellion. It's not a genuine rebellion when people from a neighboring country come to their neighbor state with arms, and not only light arms, things like even anti-aircraft, handheld anti-aircraft missiles, something that was impossible to get even from certain police stations that they had overtaken in the process. So definitely there were some groups linked to, I don't know, the parts of the administration of the president or whatever that were involved in these events. How much of that was a direct order from above? How much of that was a play of certain factions within the political system? It's impossible to say, but certainly there is a very complex situation there, and that's something to keep in mind. That not it's very naive to make judgments whether this is really controlled by Russia or not, because it might be that one party in the Russian government is actually playing its game and another is playing its own game. So that creates, of course, lots of confusion in competing policies as well. And a few points that I would like to make based on my previous experience. I did have a opportunity to witness the development of a few violent conflicts in the post-Soviet states over the last few decades. And one key lesson that I think we can make from that is that in these situations, the decisive factor is not the resources, be it human resources, be it military resources, that the sides have. The decisive factor in the outcome is actually the motivation of whatever group is involved in such conflicts. And if we look at the past conflicts that took place in the post-Soviet space, we can see that very often it is the obviously weaker side that eventually wins during the military confrontation, specifically because it turns out to be better motivated, and that's something that's very important to keep in mind. Now, moving towards solutions, first, I think that it's a very big mistake to look at solutions in a narrow way when we look at it as a particularly military conflict. For me, it just as other conflicts in the post-Soviet state, this is a conflict where it's basically a war for the hearts and minds of the population. And if we started looking at it from this angle, we might find many opportunities to make our efforts, I mean both efforts of, let's say, or civil society organizations that are working for peace, efforts of the international community, and basically everyone that is interested in peace, make them more effective. One of the problems that there is this entrenched mentality right now on both sides, and that one of the problems is that people often start focusing more and more on trying to gain control of territory than actually trying to win over the population. And I would, in many ways, resonate with the points that were made by the previous speaker, that this concept that maybe, despite the fact that there are many problems with it, but maybe the perspective of freezing the situation to a certain extent in the short term, and having Ukraine really focus on developing a more modern, more effective, and more democratic society could be maybe the most effective way in the current realities. I do not see today the possibility of a military victory in any development. It's if Russia openly interferes in Ukraine, what is probably not very likely, but openly interferes on a massive scale, makes that decision. My experience says that it will certainly be a terrible, deadly conflict with immense casualties, but that its outcome almost inevitably would be a military disaster for the Russian Federation. Similarly, I do not think that in the current situation there's a possibility for the Ukrainian military to really militarily prevail by force. So I think that in this situation, the first thing that has to be done is really pressure on all sides to implement the peace agreements that were signed, and I don't think it's right at this point, it's too early to say that they completely failed. Yes, there have been violent incidents, especially in one specific area after the peace agreements have been signed, but nonetheless, it would be naive to expect things to move very smoothly. A possibility of a third of a force of a peacekeeping force may be a very reasonable possibility. I don't know whether the sides would accept that, but nonetheless, maybe that could be a helpful step. But I think the real focus is on trying to win the future rather than to win the past. And I think that Ukraine, in that sense, has a strategic advantage because, unfortunately, the policies, the concepts that are today being imposed on the Russian population by the government and by the propaganda are concepts of the past. And while they can resonate with certain feelings that people have, they're not a foundation that you can build a modern society on. So in that sense, I think that Ukraine has to really recognize that it has a strategic advantage. And to win the peace, you need to have it. So yes, there needs to be certain concessions. There needs to be you can't, there's no absolutely ideal solution right now, but I think that focusing on the future and focusing on the really winning over the population, winning over the hearts and minds of the citizens of Ukraine, of people from all different parts of the country, and of course people from the east of Ukraine as well, is the key path in this direction. And one other thing is that, of course, it's very important to start to there's no question that Russian propaganda has been very effective in influencing people both in Russia and in certain areas in Ukraine, and has played a major role in the escalation of the conflict. But unfortunately, I often see that there's the Ukrainian media often tries to answer to this with its own sets of lies and propaganda and stories, and I should say that they're usually much less professional than the one coming from the Russian side. And I think that the best media, the best media strategy in this situation can be just trying to stick to the truth as much as possible, even when the truth might not be very favorable to your side. Nonetheless, in the long term, I think that's the only winning way for the path that Ukraine wants to take. So I think that that's something that also needs to be addressed. And finally, I would like to just give a few examples of things that are being done today by civil society groups. One of our members, our members of our network, for example, is working right now in the city of Odessa, which it's not in the east of Ukraine. Who knows? It's in actually more to the southwest of Ukraine, but it's a city where there has been lots of tensions, and there was a terrible incident on May 2nd when over 40 people were killed during a fire in one of the government buildings during these clashes that took place. And it's also one of the few cities in Ukraine where there have been attempts to maintain a civil society dialogue between groups of different political opinions, including groups that are labeled as, let's say, pro-Russian. Because the reality is that in many areas, people that do hold these views today do not feel very comfortable speaking openly about them. Well, and even in our network, there have been some heated discussions whether this is a right strategy to discuss things with these people on a part of, let's say, organizations, let's say pro-Ukrainian organizations. Well, just recently, a few weeks ago, I was in Odessa, and I witnessed one of these meetings that they were holding between the groups that have different political opinions. And one woman that I spoke to, I spoke to her first in May. It was just a few weeks after that tragic incident, and she was, let's say, from this, let's say, pro-Russian group people in town, and she mentioned, it wasn't said because I was there, it was just mentioned that one of the things she did because of these dialogues is she convinced two friends that had opinions similar to her and that were ready to go to the east and fight on the separatist side. She convinced them not to do that because of these dialogues, and because she saw that there is opportunity to discuss certain issues with her fellow citizens and solve these, or at least, address issues in a non-violent way. I think that that's just one practical example of what can be done by supporting civil society dialogue within Ukraine on all levels. And I think that that's something that really has to be strengthened. And
Thank you very much. 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 Thank
again, there's no one ideal solution, but efforts in all these directions, I believe they can help bring Ukrainian society out of the mess and on a much better to a much better future. Thank you. Was that too long?
Thank you, Andriy. Thank you. Wonderful. So we've overcome the challenges of electronics to get our first panelist here, and we've overcome the challenges of aerodynamics to get our third. John Feffer has arrived from Washington, and I should say the challenges of Canadian weather. Look, a lot of us may know John from Foreign Policy in Focus, which is the journalistic online initiative that he runs on behalf of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. He has been involved, is still involved with the Open Society Foundation, and has written extensively about international politics in books, in long and short articles, and so on. It's worth looking up his writing on a lot of these things. And his policy focus is on Central and Eastern Europe, wherever you draw those lines, and so on. Why don't I?
How long do you want me to talk?
Let's say 20 minutes max.
20 minutes max. Okay. Well, first of all, let me apologize profusely. Just like a guy from Washington to show up at the end, hasn't heard anything throughout the entire conference, and is supposed to give you some conclusions. Talk about a metaphor for the U.S. government. So, the U.S. government hasn't, in fact, been at the table, It's been letting Merkel and Hollande and others negotiate. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. government doesn't have an opinion and hasn't tried to put forward its opinion. I am going to try to be modest in my remarks here. And to begin with, I want to note that it wasn't just Canadian weather that made it difficult for me to be here. I tried to get here yesterday, not just today when the flight was delayed beyond belief. No, yesterday, and Washington, D.C. was closed down because of 4 inches of snow. 4 inches of snow. Those of you who have been to Washington, D.C. know that this capital of the most powerful country in the world is paralyzed by 4 inches of snow. Now, that too is a metaphor. It's not, because there are people out there who think somehow that the U.S. government controls everything. It controlled the Euromaidan protests. It manipulates like puppets, the Hong Kong protests, the students. Well, there's an aspiration. Sure, there are people in Washington who would like to control all of those events. But frankly, no, they can't, because 4 inches of snow makes it impossible for them to do anything. So let's be honest about what the U.S. can and cannot do, okay? Now, in terms of what the debate is in Washington, which presumably I know something about since I've been spending so much time there, as you probably know, and perhaps people have been talking about it today, the discussion in Washington has been about whether to send lethal aid to the Ukrainian government or not. And that endeavor has been postponed more or less by the successful, maybe not successful, negotiation of a ceasefire. Well, you might think that this whole debate over lethal versus non-lethal aid going to the Ukrainian government is about Ukraine. That would make sense. That seemed to make sense. That's what they're talking about. No, that's not what they're talking about. It almost has nothing to do with Ukraine. Okay, there are some people in Congress who care very much about Ukraine. But fundamentally, this is an opportunity to go after Obama for being weak, for not having the kind of forceful foreign policy the congressional leadership, i.e. the Republicans, plus lots of Democrats would like to be as strong, as hawkish on foreign policy as the Republicans, an opportunity to go after the waffler in chief, as they call President Obama, the guy who has some ambivalence about using military force. about a week ago, the National Security Strategy came out, the 2015 National Security Strategy. It's a fascinating document. Now, of course, it had to go through I don't know how many bureaucratic offices, but the result is kind of interesting because it comes out and it says basically what Obama has said all along, and when Merkel came and visited him in Washington, they both agreed that there are limits to the application of military force, and that the United States alone cannot make things change on the ground. Now this seems sensible, perhaps even very sensible here in Canada, but it is anathema. It is the gravest sin in Washington, D.C. to make this declaration. Because as far as the congressional leadership is concerned, we are still living at the height of the George W. Bush administration, when the United States asserted that it is not only the only superpower in the world, but it will do everything within its grasp, within its possibilities, to maintain that unilateral position, that unipolar position rather, and that includes unilateral action. An attempt to kind of go back to the heyday of the Bush administration, say circa 2002, is what the congressional Republicans are now after. Ukraine is part of that, and getting this lethal aid passed through. Now, I should note, and as you probably know, and perhaps people have talked about it today, is not just Congress that has supported this. John Kerry, Secretary of State, has at one point or another indicated possibly that he supports it. Biden, Vice President, possibly. It's hard to know what Biden thinks all of the time, to be honest. Leading generals in NATO support it. But Obama himself, that's where the ambivalence lies. And it's intriguing to kind of poke at that ambivalence a little bit. Why is Obama ambivalent about sending lethal aid to the Ukrainian government? Because if we unpack that, we get to the heart of what the conflict is in the United States at the moment, and possibly the role that the U.S. may or may not play in finding some kind of a solution. Though, to be honest with you, I agree with Andriy. I prefer to look at civil society rather than at governments for solutions, especially long-term solutions. So why is Obama ambivalent? Well, for one, and you can see this in the national security strategy, there is a certain nostalgia for the reset with Russia. I mean, Obama put a lot of chips into this reset with Russia, and I think he's reluctant to give it up entirely. If you look at the national security strategy, it of course says that what Russia has done is not very nice, but at the end of it, it says, but we remain open to cooperation with Russia on a wide series of issues if Russia behaves itself, essentially. Well, that gets us to point two. Obama's ambivalence on this issue is directly connected to U.S. working with Russia on a number of issues that have nothing to do with Ukraine, or very little to do with Ukraine, namely dealing with ISIS, getting a nuclear agreement with Iran. U.S.-Russian cooperation there is critical. Yeah, back in the day when there was a reset, there were some other issues on the table, like nuclear disarmament, but for the moment that seems off the table. So that's a second issue, which is, very important. And then, of course, the third is what I said before, the limits of military power. And, I would say that at the moment, the U.S. government looks at the Ukraine issue as if it were 4 inches of snow. In other words, it's waiting for the snow to melt. It doesn't want to actually act in any significant degree on this issue. Now, if it were an emergency, i.e. if Russia were to invade a NATO country, if there was massive military escalation, and we were talking about moving beyond even, say, conventional weapons, or up to the next level of conventional weapons, well, that would raise the emergency level in Washington. But at the moment, it's 4 inches of snow. And I think the Obama administration is comfortable in waiting this one out for the most part and letting the Europeans and others to negotiate this. Now, I also am uncomfortable not only coming late and giving conclusions, but I'm uncomfortable on an issue like this, which is so divided. As I was watching the audience when you were speaking, I could see people nodding their heads or shaking their heads vehemently. Like, I'm sure, you know, when I walk into a room, people want to know, well, which side is he on? Does he support the fascists in Kyiv or the fascists in Moscow? We want to know. And then we can judge whether he's telling the truth or not. Well, I have to say I know that there are some fascists in Kyiv, and I know that there's some fascists in Moscow, but generally speaking, I don't hold to either of those particular perspectives. But the degree of passion and the degree of division on this issue outside of Ukraine gives us some indication of how difficult it's going to be to resolve this issue. Now, Stephen Walt, who writes for Foreign Policy, wrote an interesting piece recently in which he talked about why we shouldn't, the United States that is, send lethal aid to Ukraine. And he said the reason why is because there are two different kinds of powers. He was trying to define what Putin's Russia is exactly. He said there are two different kinds of powers. One is the kind of power that is led by a guy who's ambitious and will seize territory, like Hitler, and will only be stopped by aggressive deterrence. Okay? The other type of power is one that acts out of insecurity and fear. And that if you try the deterrent strategy against that power, all you lead to is greater fear and insecurity, and therefore an escalating situation. So that model should, he said, tell us how to respond to Russia. If we can define what Russia is it under Putin, again, I'm talking about Putin specifically, not Russia in some abstract sense. If we can figure out whether Putin really wants to grab territory and will only stop if he must, or if he's simply acting out of fear, that determines whether we should add more weapons, so to speak, to the equation. And he said, well, my reading of it is that Putin is acting out of fear and insecurity. Therefore, if we add more weapons to the situation, he's going to feel more fear and insecurity, and he will escalate in turn. And therefore, he said, we should basically not add weapons. Well, my reading, I would love to believe that the world falls into these two categories so neatly. Unfortunately, I don't think it does. I do think that Putin does have ambitions. I don't think they are huge, grand, global ambitions. I don't even think Putin aspires to rebuild the Soviet Union. I do think, however, he would like to create basically a zone of influence around Russia, the so-called near abroad, and that will deal with feelings of fear and insecurity. In other words, it's a combination of the two. It makes it difficult, however, to figure out a solution to the situation if it straddles these two categories. I wrote a paper 15 years ago now criticizing U.S. policy toward Russia under the Clinton administration, calling it containment light, that the Clinton administration pretended that it was a friend of Russia, but in fact it was essentially reconstructing containment with a smiley face version, expanding NATO, et cetera, to the verge of Russia. This containment light, I would argue, has produced empire light as a response by Russia. And that's what we're seeing today, empire light. It's not, like I said, a grand, ambitious territorial grab by Putin that will go to the Baltic Sea or grab Romania or whatever. No, it's limited, and it's limited, I would argue, to the sphere around Russia of these frozen conflicts that we heard mention of earlier, and perhaps you talked about them lots today, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and now Eastern Ukraine. When we start talking about solutions, and this is the last section that I'll talk about, conflict resolution experts talk about ripeness. Ripeness. Is a conflict ripe for resolution? Now, that term ripe is a euphemism. It's a because it sounds nice, doesn't it? When fruit is ripe, it's ready to eat. But no, it's not. It's a terrible word, because what it really means is that there's been so much terrible bloodshed that finally the parties to the conflict realize that they can't slog through the blood and the mud anymore. The Korean War reached ripeness, so to speak, after 3 years. But frankly, it was only the first year of the Korean War that showed these massive changes in the fortunes of the armies. As one went up the peninsula, the other went down the peninsula. The last 2 years of the Korean War, there's practically no movement whatsoever, but there was still a lot of loss of life. The situation became ripe only when the North Koreans plus the Chinese on the one hand and the South Koreans plus the US on the other hand figured out that they basically could not gain another inch of territory. They could not without, again, losing more and more people, and that in their respective countries, for whatever reason, there was no stomach for it any longer. Unfortunately, I don't think we've come to the ripeness, so to speak, in Ukraine. I don't think the rebels at this point believe that they can't get more territory. I think they do believe they can get more territory. Regardless of whether the heavy artillery is withdrawn, regardless of whether fighting continues in the various sections, I do believe in the leadership, the rebels still believe they can seize more territory. I also think that the Ukrainian government harbors a hope that it can maintain territorial integrity, which would ultimately mean pushing the rebels back. In other words, we're not there yet for that kind of mediation. When Merkel was asked, well, what if this ceasefire doesn't work? What's plan B? Well, she didn't really have a plan B. I don't think anybody really has a plan B, but there was this kind of thought of a demilitarized zone, a kind of what you were speaking of, a freeze to a certain extent, to let people kind of figure out what comes next. Coming from a Korean context, the demilitarized zone is not the kind of analogy we want to see, because of course the DMZ has been in place since 1953. That's a really long time. I don't think anybody wants to see a demilitarized zone in Ukraine last that long. And here I really hope you do talk either as a result of questions or just among ourselves about the examples of South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria. These are what I call ghost limb scenarios. These are areas where the central governments of Georgia and Moldova, in these two cases, I still think that they have these limbs, but when they look down, all they see is emptiness. There's this sensation, there's this feeling that the limb should be there, but it's a ghost limb, and it's a ghost sensation. And I think ultimately what we're looking at in eastern Ukraine is a ghost limb in the making. It's not fair. Are we going to come up with a fair solution? Geopolitics is not fair. There's nothing fair about it. The war's not fair. Many of the people who are not acting out of justice. This is not a fair situation. We're not going to get a fair solution. What we hope for is a solution that minimizes pain and suffering among the most people possible. And from that point of view, I think the central government in Ukraine would best be advised to think about this ghost limb possibility. I'll end with a terrible analogy, but one I'm afraid might apply to this situation. Has anybody seen the movie 127 Hours? 127 Hours, Aaron Ralston, a hiker in Utah, knew what he was doing, went out there, hiked around, until he fell in a crevasse and a boulder right down on his arm. Pinned him. Now, for the first 165 hours, he was like, I can get out of this. I got some food, I got some water, someone will come by. And then it dawned on him, his food was running out, his water was running out, and his time was running out. And the only thing he had was a not very sharp utility knife. And you can watch the movie if you have stomach for it, but that's what we're talking about. That's the situation. And I think Ukraine would be well advised to consider that, however painful it will be. And again, it's not fair. It wasn't fair for the boulder to fall on Aaron Ralston's arm. It's not fair. But this is a terrible situation. And we have to work at the governmental level and the civil society level to find a solution that can minimize the pain and suffering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Often do. Let me just ask you, as we gather a few questions here, talking about Washington's reluctant role in this, the sense I've got all along in this conflict is that Washington in general, maybe until now, or maybe even now, has generally wanted this to be something that's dealt with by the Europeans. I mean, and I think it's largely because Washington and Ottawa as well had put a lot of money into democracy movements in Ukraine over the years. 10 years ago with the first anti-Yanukovych movement, we sunk a lot of money into it. Canada, for the first time, overtly supported an anti-government movement. Some support for Tymoshenko and so on over the years, all of which came to naught. And there was a real desire by North American governments to back away from that. And I think during the Maidan protests, what was striking was Washington's absence in that whole thing. I mean, famously, some State Department official was bugged discussing which post-Yanukovych candidate would be preferred. I thought the astonishing thing in that was, first of all, that she picked the right guy, and second of all, that it was taking place so late in the game when the government had almost fallen, and there still wasn't really any support from Washington. There was a real sense of let's let Europe, and particularly Germany, handle this. Has there been a sea change, like since MH17, since these ceasefire talks, or is there still a sense that this is a European problem? This is not for the United States to be engaged in?
Well, I think, again, when we talk about the United States, there are a number of different actors here, and each of them has a different motivation. I think the Obama administration, Obama himself, and John Kerry, to a certain extent, as Secretary of State, they have a limited amount of diplomatic capital, shall we say. And that capital they can spend in the United States and internationally. And they've identified what the priorities are. Number one priority is Iran in terms of diplomacy. Number two priority, if we're talking about international relations more generally, is dealing with ISIS. Ukraine, it's important. There's no question it's important because transatlantic relations are important. NATO is important. Democracy promotion to a certain extent in the State Department is important. But if the Obama administration has to go to bat for an issue, has to use its political capital to persuade members of Congress who are generally hostile to its foreign policy, Ukraine is not top of the list. I mean, look at Cuba. I mean, the United States couldn't do that by itself. It had to rely on the good offices of Canada and the good offices of the Pope. I mean, it wasn't Obama out there doing this diplomacy himself because of, even though there had been a sea change in attitudes in the United States on Cuba, it still was too much of a political risk to be involved in the actual diplomacy. It was hard enough to get the agreement, passed through, and we still are dealing with an economic embargo. So I think it's a question of priority, and it's a question of which kind of branch we're talking about here in terms of the United States.
Well, thank you. And we have some quite nice questions coming in, actually, I've got to say. Let me read you a pair that involve a good question about this, which is NATO's position in all this. And I think these two are related questions. Would NATO's demise take the fear out of Russia of the Eastern European theater? And a related one, if Ukraine would renounce ever to join NATO, if it would declare that it is never going to consider joining NATO, would we have peace in Ukraine and conditions for territorial integrity. Let me first see if Andriy Kulykov is there. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
What do you think of this question? Is NATO the solution for Ukraine, or is distancing itself from NATO a solution?
Distancing ourselves from NATO may be a temporary solution until, again, the things fall into a pattern when Russia needs some foreign enemy, external enemy. And Ukraine is a logical external enemy for Russia to beef up the muscles, beef up the mood of the people. So basically, I think that as long as there's independent Ukraine, then whatever it does, whatever it says, does not safeguard independence with such a neighbor as we have now in modern Russia. I mean, in today's Russia. Does not necessarily mean that Russia will stay the same forever.
And do either of you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I can say a few words. Till about a year ago, I think it was pretty clear that Ukraine was, in fact, there was a overwhelming feeling in Ukrainian society that the best option for Ukraine would be this neutral state position. And it's these events of the last year that changed this. So the problem is that even if this kind of solution would take the fear out of Russia and would help, the problem today is how do you sell this solution to the people of Ukraine that have been influenced profoundly by the events of the past year. And there was a joke, actually, I heard in Ukraine recently that exactly about that, yes, Ukraine should sign a agreement, sign a declaration that it will be a neutral state, and to sign that declaration, it should use the back side of the paper of the Budapest Declaration that it signed with Russia 20 years ago, when Russia promised to guarantee its territorial integrity. You know,
not only Russia, but the U.S. and UK as well.
Yes, exactly.
It's a funny thing. I mean, I get the sense that if NATO had expanded into Ukraine 11 years ago, as some member states of NATO, although not most, wanted to do at the time, this conflict would be even more unresolvable now. And I know there are people who feel otherwise, who feel that if Ukraine had been in NATO, that it would be a firewall, and Russia and its proxies would never have got involved. I have a feeling it would have been much tougher. NATO has always been more effective in support of countries that are not members of NATO. In fact, it has only ever been used in support of countries that are not members of NATO.
Well, that would prove, though, that...
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder, even a dozen years ago, Russian military officers would quite happily say to me, yes, we fully expect to be part of this military alliance, even if it's not called NATO in the future, because we have common enemies with Europe. Certainly when Sarkozy and company were talking about getting rid of NATO and replacing it with a European defense something or other, that was a positive idea in Russia. So it's a very, very recent thing, this idea that the old Cold War lines. I think the earlier expansion of NATO didn't help. It didn't help to have Poland and the Baltic states in, who really were trying to pressure within NATO to have its tanks lined up against the eastern border again, and that sort of thing. But at this point, does it make a difference? Let me turn, unless you have something to add to that, John.
Got a big stack there.
Yeah. Somebody asks, what is the best thing that Canada can do to help diffuse the conflict. And let me also read a related one. How are sanctions against Russia affecting Europe, Canada, and the United States? I.e., how will they affect the West? This, by the way, is a germane question in Canada. Canada's Conservative government announced what seemed to be very tough sanctions against Russian individuals and institutions and corporations, tougher than some other countries on paper, and then quietly backed off them to a huge degree and didn't institute them to a major degree, but because an exemption was put in place saying we're going to withdraw sanctions that could affect Canadian companies that have business interests, notably petroleum companies, which is a pretty big part of the economy, because there was a bunch of the oil patch executives went to Ottawa and said, look, if you institute these sanctions, we're going to lose very large parts of our, we're providing the oil infrastructure for a huge part of the, and suddenly what was tough sanctions became very mild sanctions. So it's a reasonable question. How well are sanctions going to work when we have some form of economic engagement going on? Who'd like to take that? John, you feel like?
I don't want to speak about
Yeah.
Canada. No, the last person should speak about Canada.
Well, all I can say is that I think that the drop in oil prices had an effect that is far, far greater on the Russian economy than all the sanctions. So right now, and it's a question, how much did this drop in oil prices, how much did it have to do with Western policies and sanctions and all that? Probably not so much, but that really made and is making now people feel, and ordinary Russian citizens pay a much higher price. I mean, prices in stores went up like probably about 25–30% over the last few months. How much effect will that have on policies and what effect it will be, it's very hard to predict.
Here we have a question from somebody. Would Putin even allow Ukraine to cut off the, quote, phantom limb, as you said, of East Ukraine? Or is Putin's entire objective to maintain control of Ukraine through regions with veto power over national policies?
Well, I don't presume to know what goes on in Putin's brain. It's difficult, even in the best circumstances, to know what goes on in any leader's mind, but Putin in particular. However, based on my reading of what he's done over the last decade or so, he is, first of all, quite smart. Second of all, he knows what the limitations of Russian military power are to a certain extent. And when he talks about the recreation of Novorossiya, that I think is more aspirational than actually a battle plan. I think he is willing to compromise in order, if he sees that his primary objective has been realized. Primary objective in this case is to create a kind of a zone around Russia that the control of is at least ambiguous. Beyond that, I don't think he actually has any grand ambitions. I mean, take a look at Transnistria. I mean, Transnistria doesn't border Russia, and it hasn't so far been, there hasn't been this effort by Russia to kind of absorb Transnistria in any meaningful way, because, frankly, it would be very difficult to do so. The notion that he's trying to create a land bridge, for instance, down through southern Ukraine to connect to Transnistria. I mean, I just don't see it happening. It doesn't make geostrategic sense. And there haven't been moves by the Russian Federation toward that. So yes, I do ultimately think that Putin would accept the so-called ghost limb scenario as he's accepted it in other areas around Russia. So you might disagree.
I just probably would question your idea that he's a clever because if you look at the actual consequences of his policies, I mean, even from basically his, again, you can't say what his point of view is, but from the point of view that is being declared officially in propaganda in the media, you know, the consequences, the long-term consequences are disastrous. A year ago, the attitude in Ukraine toward Russia was very, very different. And there wasn't even a serious issue of NATO, joining NATO and things like that. Now the question is how to explain to the Ukrainian people that they don't have this right. You know, so it's.
Well, that's true,
Yeah.
but I mean, look at the debate that's going on in Eastern Europe today. I mean, you have a situation in which Viktor Orban of Hungary has basically said, hey, I'm with you, Putin. Miloš Zeman, president of the Czech Republic, though he has some disagreement within his own party, he too has basically said, hey, we got to go careful on these sanctions. I don't necessarily agree with them. In other words, Putin has been able to divide Eastern Europe against itself, because there are other leaders in Eastern Europe, of course, Donald Tusk in Poland, though he's no longer the head, the prime minister, famously disagreed with Orban and others. So now, when I say smart, that isn't necessarily a term of endearment, or what I mean is that A, he has maintained his popularity within Russia. B, he's continued to add to his own personal wealth and the wealth of those around him. C, he's kind of created Russia in his own image, the bureaucracy in his own image, the ruling structures. From that point of view, there are going to be consequences, because there are always going to be consequences. And I think maybe he did miscalculate what Ukrainian public opinion would be vis-a-vis NATO. But if he's going to trade a band of territory that is essentially capable of being manipulated by him for the rest of Ukraine possibly joining NATO at some point in the future, who knows when, he might consider that, frankly, a good trade.
Yeah, but it's not all about what he considers, and you know, it's much more complex. You know, it's not a chessboard. You know, people speak about these, but you're dealing with human beings.
That's true. I was only because the question was about Putin. It didn't really ask about.
Okay,
the
I think we should
Silovki or
stop
something.
discussing things between ourselves and answer questions.
Sure. This is an interesting one. U.S. provision of military aid to Ukraine would be seen by Moscow as a declaration of war and spark a global escalation of Ukraine's separatist conflict. The question is, why does Kyiv insist on the military solution to the conflict instead of accepting the concept of federalization like we have here in Canada? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's that ship has sailed in the case of Crimea, which has been declared Russian territory, making the concept of federalization difficult. And I should say that everywhere else in eastern Ukraine is much trickier, because in Canada we have one province that has an overwhelming majority of francophones, and we have 9 that have an overwhelming majority of anglophones. In even the most ethnically and linguistically Russian parts of eastern Ukraine, maybe the most Russian is 1/3 in any of those parts, which makes it, and of that 1/3, as Andriy said in over Skype, many of them are loyal to Kyiv. Many of the ethnic Ukrainian and linguistic Ukrainians, some anyway, have mixed loyalties and so on, especially now that the Ukrainian military and the Russian military have both hurt a lot of civilians and changed people's loyalties. So there's that problem. But here's a question, yes. Why not just, I mean, that's almost what you're partly suggesting with the freeze. Would the outcome of that be a federal structure? And if there's a federal structure, is it going to end up like Canada, or is it going to end up like South Ossetia and Abkhazia?
Well, if I would know how things end up, I would be a rich man today. But I think that we're speaking. Of course, first of all, it's for Ukraine to decide whether they need a federal structure and so forth. And if you ask my opinion, I don't see anything terrible in that. But it's not. The problem is who decides this? Is it the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government that decide, or can this be imposed on them as some kind of deal between Putin and Merkel and Obama and so forth? When we're speaking about a frozen conflict, in reality, unfortunately, we're not speaking about federalization in a sense. We're speaking about freezing something, at least to the level that we have in Transnistria, where people have not been killing each other since 1992. And that's a big achievement. But, of course, you can't say that Moldova is a federal state and these issues have been resolved. But there's a big difference between a war where there's officially over 5,000 casualties in 1 year and a frozen conflict where there hasn't been any casualties for over 20 years now. So if we can move toward that state, and I believe if Ukraine can really start focusing on changing itself, on living up to the aspirations that people had when they went to the Maidan, then I believe that eventually this war for hearts and minds can be won, but without weapons. But of course, that's a long shot from where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The federalism is not something you can impose, from above, either through an agreement by other leaders or even by the government itself. It really has to be something that is the outcome of a discussion. And obviously, we're not talking about a discussion right now in Ukraine. We're talking about, at best, the possibility of freezing the conflict. If you look at what happened in Yugoslavia, there were plenty of discussions of federation, confederation from 1988, basically, until 1990, 1991. And there were great discussions about federation and confederation. It involved lots of people and civil society organizations and the various republics. And it was an interesting discussion, but events overtook that. And that whole discussion of federalism and confederalism disappeared completely because of the breakdown of civil order, essentially. And we're dealing with a similar situation in which the discussion of federalism, which had been taking place even before the Euromaidan and certainly afterwards, was overtaken by events.
That's interesting. Yes, exactly. Federalism has been in the air in Ukraine for a long time. Here's a question. If it can be said that an overwhelming majority of the population of an area desire to leave country A and join country B, and I'm not sure what hypothetically we were talking about here, and country B takes that area by force instead of the correct way of a referendum, what value is there in returning that area to country A? And I think the underlying question here is, Crimea is a bit of a different kettle of fish than anything else in this conflict. And it's always puzzled me because I'm quite sure that if Vladimir Putin had wanted Crimea to become part of the Russian Federation, he could have done so in a way that would be fully accepted by the entire world. The impulse within the population there is strong enough that he could easily have stirred up a separation movement had the population hold a referendum much like Scotland's last year, except that it would almost certainly have been a majority in the yes camp, and won a majority victory in a fair and full referendum that would have been accepted by most of the countries of the world, and that would have been that, and so on. And the fact that this military intervention followed by a cooked-up referendum that wouldn't be accepted by anybody was instead done kind of indicates that the end goal is not to gain territory or bring together the great ethnic Russian solidarity, but is something else, and so on. But aside from questions of Eastern Ukraine and the wider conflict, is there any way that with Crimea we're ever going to put the champagne bottle cork back in the bottle? I mean, we're at a point where everybody recognizes that Crimea is going to be hard for Russia to let go of. On the other hand, Russia's done it in a way that no major country could ever possibly accept legally. There's no way we could ever accept Russia having taken that territory in that way as an antecedent. Is it going to remain ambiguous forever?
Go down to Texas, talk to people down there. Texas wasn't, taken by the United States in a free and fair way. We seized it from Mexico, and there's still a lot of, even, more than 100 and God knows how many years afterwards, there's still tensions on that issue. But, so people will say that yes, time.
France recognized it almost immediately, though.
Well, they were our partners, and they had their own Napoleonic thing going on. But so you could say that after a certain period of time, geopolitical order kind of heals around any kind of break, however that break happened. But the tensions are going to remain, even if 20, 25 years down the line. What my hope is, both with Crimea and all the other frozen conflicts, is that we see something somewhat similar to what's going on in Yugoslavia today. There we had, again, a country that was torn apart by war, but you have half of that former country now part of the European Union, and most of those entities basically reconstructing a Yugosphere. They don't call it that, but of necessity, they are neighbors, and there are economic, commercial, political interests in dealing with one another. They've managed after a while to more or less deal with questions of genocide, questions of war crimes, etc., and they are dealing with practical issues. It would be my hope that 25, 30, 40 years down the line, we would see that happening in this region as well, as the proximate reasons for the division, for the conflict, whether it be ethnic or territorial, ideological, and all three have a role to play, have faded to a certain extent, and the regions cooperate with one another for pragmatic, practical reasons. It may be part of some new regional organization, as ex-Yugoslavia works with one another within the EU structures, or it simply could be outside of any kind of regional structure.
I just wanted to make one little comment on Crimea. I think it's not that clear that there was such an overwhelming majority for the outcome that we face today. That has not been supported by opinion polls that have been carried out, maybe a year ago or so before all these events happened. The party led by Mr. Aksionov, who's now the official leader there, I think it got something like 4% on the last election, this Unity Party, in Crimea. So, and one other thing, in our network there were about 4 or 5 active members from civil society organizations in Crimea. These were people of different ethnic backgrounds, different ethnic origin. Some were ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, one woman, her parents are Italian actually. Crimea is actually a very multi-ethnic area. It's not just Russians and Crimean Tatars. It has a very long history, and it has ancient Greek settlements going down to 500-600 BC and so forth. All these people, members of our network, none of them remain in Crimea today. Most of them are now in Kyiv, other parts of Ukraine. One person migrated to the United States.
2 questions for John Feffer, and or for anyone, I suppose. 2 is what is happening an expression of an America in retreat run by a weak president? And this one, are there factions in the United States that might wish to draw Russia into an accelerated military intervention specifically to collapse the Russian state?
That's an interesting scenario. So the first question, are we talking about America in retreat led by a weak president? That's certainly the way John Boehner, for instance, in Congress has characterized the president. And certainly some of the people who are jockeying for the Republican 2016 presidential nomination, Jeb Bush and others, it is an extremely useful political point to make because the idea that the world is less safe today than when President Obama took over in 2009 is a powerful campaign message. Even if it's difficult to show how the Obama administration has in any way contributed to making the world a less safe place. I personally think that the Obama administration is as committed to maintaining U.S. power in the world as all previous U.S. presidencies. I mean, just take a look at the Pentagon spending. It's not like it went down under Obama. In fact, it's been going up pretty steadily over the last couple of years. It was a slight dip for a bit, but certainly over the last couple of years. Has the president scaled back on drone attacks? No, I mean, he actually rapidly expanded it immediately after he took office. It's fallen off less recently. So he hasn't involved the United States in any major ground wars, as the Bush administration did, aside from the escalation in Afghanistan. And one could argue that, and certainly the Republican leadership has argued, that that's an indication of weakness, that the United States should never have cut and run from either Afghanistan or Iraq, but that, as far as I'm concerned, is fallacious thinking. So no, I don't think the United States is, under the Obama administration, at least it doesn't think of itself as a nation in decline led by a weak president. Second question is, are there people is there a faction, a political faction in the United States, in the Congress, I imagine, that would like to see the collapse of Russia as a result of this adventurism in Ukraine? I mean, there might be. I mean, remember, we're talking about the United States here, folks. We're talking about some political parties which are so far out there, and political factions that, you know, it boggles the mind what they actually think. The Tea Party and their notions of foreign policy are beyond the realm of, frankly, human understanding. So, yes, maybe there are people who believe that nonsense, that such a scenario could take place. But even among, I would say, the neoconservatives, or the remnants of the neoconservatives, they're not really looking at that as a scenario. I mean, they're much more interested in a kind of a stable order within which the United States can reconstruct its kind of unilateral actions and unipolar positions of the height of the Bush administration. So that kind of the collapse of Russia would introduce such unpredictability into international relations that even neoconservatives, Robert Kagan, for instance, to name just one, I think would say, no, that makes me a little uncomfortable. So they would leave that kind of thinking to Tea Party folks and the like.
Andriy Kulykov, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I'm listening with great interest to some of the presumptions. Like for instance, the idea of holding a referendum like in Scotland to solve the issue. Do you honestly believe that Russia or Ukraine, for that matter, are able to hold a referendum like in Scotland? Mm-hmm. Do we have a capacity? Do we have a tradition? And all this kind of stuff. As far as the Russian language, if I heard rightly, this was formulated as the second in a federation. There's no federation yet. From what I know, Russian language has not been persecuted in Ukraine. And again, it is a very, very convenient pretext to say that Russian language is being oppressed or whatever, they could have made it a second official language. They could have made it a second state language, or not necessarily the second, just on a par. It wouldn't have changed a bit, because I may argue that the entire idea to topple Yanukovych was Mr. Putin's idea, because cui prodest, who gained because Yanukovych went away? What would have been the pretext of invading Crimea if Yanukovych was in place? Whom would Mr. Putin protect from the Ukrainian nationalists? Or rather, who will be the scarecrow? Mr. Yanukovych? No. By unleashing the preventive economic war against Ukraine in summer 2013, Russia has precipitated a lot of protest in this country. They have hit the eastern regions, which really depended on Russia. Lots of people there worked on enterprises that worked with Russia and all this kind of stuff. So what Canada can do for Ukraine? Think of Ukraine when there is peace. And by the way, tell us honestly and in great detail, how do you manage to live in this Federation of Europe? So that when we have settled our problems, and when we have secured peace, we could build a country much better than we have now, notwithstanding Russian interference or non-Russian interference. There's a lot of Ukrainian problems from Ukraine. I'm very grateful to the Russian participant in the discussion who pointed a couple of very, very important things, including the what he called the Ukrainian propaganda. As a journalist in Ukraine, I must admit that, yes, this is one of the problems that we try to counter the Russian propaganda with our own propaganda. And if I have heard him rightly, he says that truth is the best option. This I support wholeheartedly. And when talking about Ukraine, about Russia, about everywhere in the world, let's not sort of build theories. Let's look at what is happening at the ground, on the ground. There is no federation yet, and I doubt that it will happen. A referendum like in Scotland, I think that we have to live for another 20 or 30 years before we or Russia may organize such a referendum. And as far as Crimea is concerned, the fact that they have invaded it is, to my mind, the best proof of the fact that otherwise they couldn't have gained this land. So this is what I think.
Yeah, here's a question that I think is sort of a next step sort of question. Is it possible to create a normal societal environment with the presence of a militarized society, military personnel there?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that we're speaking about a fairly small part of Ukrainian territory. It's only about a third, maybe a little more than a third of 2 Ukrainian provinces. So we're not speaking about eastern Ukraine as such. Second, when we speak about the frozen conflict, the alternative to that is not a democratic lasting peace. The alternative to a frozen conflict is an active conflict where people are killing each other. So it's not a question of what's better. It's not a question. I'm sorry. It's a question of what's better. It's not a question of what we wish for. And I think that the most important outcome is that even that kind of peace could provide the opportunity that Ukraine needs to really start focusing on building a modern society and a modern democracy that would work in the interest of the people. And that gives that any form of peace can give Ukraine a chance to win the peace. Now, that's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that Ukraine will win peace, but at least to have that chance, you need to have peace.
It's the open question of whether we're going to have in this freeze. Would this thing called Donetsk Republic exist in some nominal way as a frozen entity? Would the pseudo-bureaucracy set up by the rebels and their supporters there continue to act as a de facto government? Would those conflict reach? Are we in human rights situation? Several people have raised this under rebel control is pretty dire. Are we freezing things that are unacceptable?
I think the case of Kosovo in some senses is not comparable. I mean, I wish it were comparable, in some sense, because the case of Kosovo is somewhat hopeful, because if you looked at the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo at the end of the war, it looked as if there would never be any compromise. Serbia would never allow this entity to become an independent country. But there has been a sea change in attitudes in the government in Serbia. Some of the same people at the head of the government today in Serbia.
Because they have a chance to join those European
Precisely, and that's why the situation of Kosovo is different. Exactly. There is some external force for both Kosovo and for Serbia, which pushes them together, which provides, shall we say, the ripeness for some kind of a negotiated solution there. For the frozen conflicts we're talking about, they don't have that external. If they're lucky, these sections of Donetsk and Luhansk would have the status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Remember, South Ossetia and Abkhazia have, I think, 4 countries in the world that have recognized them. There's Russia, there's Nicaragua, there's Nauru, and I forget the Venezuela.
Various people depended on
Transnistria, and correct me if I'm wrong, has nobody. Not even Russia has recognized Transnistria.
No, nobody wants it.
Well, I mean, that's what we're talking about, a frozen conflict which will have negligible international legitimacy, negligible economic viability. It has some coal, of course. It will be dealing with the consequences of this war and the human rights violations. We're talking about a very, very challenging situation for the people living there now. And I think, as you said, the best situation is the lack of everyday violence at this point. That's the best situation we can hope for.
I want to thank people, but I want to again reiterate this thing. This, you see scienceforpeace.ca. All you have to do is, after that, is put a / and 1357. That will take you to the place where you're going to overcome tyranny. You will be able to express yourself. You'll be able to fight back. You will be able to say anything you want as long as it's decent.